They were hungry. Not the polite, mild hunger of someone who missed a meal. The deep, bone-level hunger of men who had been walking for days. Through heat, through dust, through terrain that did not care about them at all, that simply sat there wide and indifferent, demanding to be crossed. And they crossed it, tens of thousands of them, moving in formation across the hills and valleys of southern Africa, the most feared fighting force on the continent. Men who could cover 50 miles in a day on foot, without horses, without wheels, without anything except their legs and their discipline and whatever food they had managed to carry or find along the way. Tonight we are not talking about the battles. We are not talking about the victories or the strategies or the famous commanders. Tonight we are going somewhere more personal than that. Tonight we are going to the food, the real food, the forgotten food. The meals that kept these men alive and moving and capable of the extraordinary physical feats that made the Zulu army one of the most remarkable military forces in the history of the world. 15 meals. 15 windows into the real, lived, bodily experience of a Zulu warrior on the long march. Before we begin, this channel exists because of you. Because you keep coming back. Because you keep sharing these stories and telling other people about this fire. If you have not subscribed yet, do it now. And if you have, thank you. Genuinely. You are why this keeps going. Drop something in the comments tonight. Tell us, what time is it where you are right now? We want to know where in the world these stories are landing. Drop your time and your city. We read every single one. Now, let us go to the march. The body that had to keep moving. Before we get to the food itself, before we talk about what the warriors ate and how they found it and what it meant, we need to understand the body we are feeding. Because the Zulu warrior's body on a long march was not an ordinary body doing ordinary things. It was a machine operating at the edge of what human physiology can sustain. And understanding the physical reality of what the march demanded is what makes the food meaningful. Not just interesting, meaningful. The Zulu military system at its peak under Shaka and the kings who followed him was built around one central, non-negotiable physical reality: speed. The Impi, the Zulu fighting force, moved on foot, always on foot. No horses, no supply wagons, no long, slow columns of pack animals carrying provisions across the landscape the way European armies of the same period moved. Just men, and legs, and the ground beneath them. And the pace those legs maintained was extraordinary. Accounts from the period, from traders, missionaries, and military observers who watched the Zulu army move, describe a formation of warriors covering ground at a rate that made observers genuinely disbelieve what they were seeing. 50 miles in a single day was not exceptional for a Zulu impi on the march. It was expected. It was built into the military system as a baseline capability. Think about what that means physically. 50 miles. On foot. Through the varied terrain of southern Africa. Hills, valleys, rivers, open grassland, dense bush. Without paved roads. Without the mechanical advantage of wheels or animals. Just human legs, carrying the weight of a man's body and his weapons and whatever else he was carrying, for the entire length of a day. At that pace, for that distance, the human body burns through its energy reserves at a rate that demands constant replenishment. The muscles need fuel. The cardiovascular system needs fuel. The brain, which is making constant decisions about terrain and formation and the thousand small physical adjustments of cross-country movement, needs fuel. Without sufficient food and water, a body doing this work does not simply slow down. It shuts down. Not gradually, not gently, but suddenly, in the way that machines fail when a critical threshold is crossed. The legs stop working properly. The judgment goes. The ability to maintain formation, to respond to commands, to function as a disciplined fighting unit, All of it degrades rapidly once the energy reserves are gone. The Zulu military commanders understood this completely. The feeding of the army was not an afterthought. It was a military problem of the highest priority. And the solutions that Zulu military culture developed for this problem, the foods, the preparation methods, the supply systems, the foraging practices, are what we are going to explore tonight. The Zulu warrior's body itself was the first part of the solution. From boyhood, young men in Zulu society were conditioned to physical hardship in ways that modern people would find remarkable. The Amabutho system, the age regiment system that formed the structural backbone of the Zulu military, began its work early. Boys were organized into groups by age and put through years of physical development that progressively built the capacity for sustained effort. Running. Long-distance running specifically, not sprinting but the steady, sustainable pace of a body that has learned to move efficiently over distance. This was practiced constantly, from a young age, until the body internalized it, until the efficient long-distance gait became as natural as walking. Physical hardship was deliberately introduced into the training experience, going without food for extended periods, enduring cold, managing fatigue through mental discipline rather than rest. These were not punishments, they were preparations. The logic being, a warrior who has never experienced hunger will be panicked and disabled by it on the march. A warrior who has trained in hunger, who knows what it feels like, who has learned to manage it, to function through it, will handle it as a managed condition rather than a crisis. This is sophisticated sports science, arrived at through generations of practical military experience rather than laboratory research. But the principle is identical to what modern endurance athletes and military training programs understand about preparing the body for extreme sustained effort. The body you are feeding on the Zulu Long March is therefore not a random civilian body thrown into extreme conditions. It is a body that has been specifically prepared for those conditions, that has been trained to be efficient with fuel, that has learned to extract maximum performance from minimum input, which means the food that body receives does not need to be abundant. It needs to be right. The logistics of feeding an impi on the march operated on several levels simultaneously. At the most basic level, each warrior carried his own provisions. Not enormous quantities. The weight had to be manageable, had to be consistent with the mobility that was the impi's greatest military asset. But a core supply of calorie-dense, lightweight, preservation-stable food that could sustain the individual warrior through the initial days of a march. We will talk about the specific foods in detail. They are the heart of tonight's story. But understanding the carrying system matters first. The warrior did not carry provisions in a pack or a bag in the European military sense. He carried them on his body and in simple containers. A small pouch, a gourd, items tucked into clothing or worn on the body in ways that did not impede movement. This meant that what he carried had to be extraordinarily energy-dense relative to its weight and volume. Foods that delivered maximum calories and minimum mass. Foods that did not spoil quickly in heat. Foods that could be eaten on the move without preparation, without fire, without water, without stopping. The Zulu military food culture developed, over generations, a specific repertoire of foods that met these requirements. Not because someone designed the system from scratch, but because generations of practical experience, of armies moving and fighting and learning what sustained them and what did not, accumulated into a body of knowledge that was passed down through the military culture. This knowledge is what we are recovering tonight. At the second level, the impi was supplied from outside. When an impi moved through Zulu territory, through the kingdom's own land, there was a supply system operating alongside and behind it. Young boys called Udabi served the warriors. They were not fighters. Their role was logistical, carrying additional supplies, managing the heavier items that the warriors themselves could not carry without compromising their mobility. The Utabi carried, among other things, the cooking equipment and additional food supplies that could not be carried in the warrior's personal kit. When the Impi stopped to rest or to camp, the Utabi were the ones who prepared the more substantial meals, the cooked food that supplemented the warrior's personal rations and provided the deeper caloric restoration that the body needed after extreme exertion. This two-tier system, personal carried rations for mobility, supplementary cooked meals at rest, was elegant in its practicality. It gave the warriors both the sustained fuel of a personal kit that moved with them every step and the deeper nutritional restoration of proper cooking when conditions allowed. At the third level, when the Impi moved beyond Zulu territory into contested or enemy land, the supply system changed fundamentally. The Utabi supply line could not always follow. The logistical network of the home territory did not exist in foreign land, and the Impi could not slow down to manage a heavy supply train without losing the speed advantage that was its primary military asset. In these conditions, the warriors foraged. They lived off the land, off what the terrain they were moving through could provide, supplementing their carried rations with whatever they found, caught, harvested, or, in the context of raids and campaigns against enemy settlements, took. This foraging capability was itself a trained skill, knowing what the landscape offered, knowing which plants were edible and which were not, knowing how to find water in dry country, knowing how to hunt quickly and efficiently, knowing how to process what you found with minimal equipment and minimal time. A Zulu warrior was not just a fighter. He was a man comprehensively prepared to survive and operate in the southern African landscape under conditions of physical extremity. The food he ate, all 15 categories of it that we will explore tonight, reflects this comprehensive preparation. There is one more thing to understand before we get to the food. The Zulu relationship with hunger was not what most modern people's relationship with hunger is. For most people in the modern world, hunger is a minor discomfort to be addressed quickly, a signal to eat, an inconvenience. The idea of deliberately managing hunger, of choosing to operate hungry rather than slow down to eat, feels extreme, even alarming. In Zulu warrior culture, hunger was managed, not ignored, not denied, but consciously managed, as a condition to be understood, worked with, stretched further than ordinary experience suggests is possible. The training process specifically developed the warrior's ability to function effectively at levels of hunger that would disable an untrained person. This matters for understanding the food, because the food of the Zulu Long March was not designed to eliminate hunger. It was designed to keep the body operational, to maintain the muscle function, the cardiovascular capacity, the cognitive clarity needed to march and fight and march again. The warrior was not eating to feel full. He was eating to keep moving. And everything about the food, the types, the quantities, the preparation methods, the timing, was oriented around that single central purpose. Keep the body moving. Keep the Impi moving. That is where we begin. Meal 1. Mkando. The dried meat that built an army. The first thing in the warrior's kit. The foundation of everything else. The food that was always there, when nothing else was available, when the march had gone longer than expected, when the supply lines had fallen behind, Mkando was there. Dried meat. Not jerky in the casual snack food sense that the modern world knows it. Something older than that. Something more serious. Meat that had been prepared with specific intent for a specific purpose. To sustain a man's body through extreme exertion over an extended period. The preparation began before the march. Meat, primarily beef, from the cattle that were the central economic and cultural resource of Zulu society, was cut into long, thin strips. Not thick pieces, thin. The thickness mattered because thin strips dried faster and more completely, reducing the moisture content that allows spoilage to begin. The strips were hung or laid in the sun and the dry air to cure. In the climate of the Zulu heartland, the hills and valleys of what is now KwaZulu-Natal, the combination of strong sunlight and dry air created good drying conditions. The process took several days. Done properly, it produced meat that had lost most of its moisture content. Meat that was hard, dense, almost rigid. Meat that would not spoil for weeks or months under normal conditions. Salt was used where available, rubbed into the meat during preparation to draw out additional moisture and to add preservation. Spices and other flavorings were sometimes incorporated, not for luxury, but for the additional antimicrobial properties that certain plant compounds provide. The result was extraordinarily calorie-dense relative to its weight. A small piece of properly dried meat, a piece that weighed almost nothing in the warrior's kit, contained enough protein and fat to sustain a man's muscles through hours of sustained effort. Protein for the muscle fibers doing the work of covering ground. Fat for the slow-burning energy reserves that endurance effort draws on. The warrior ate it on the move. No preparation needed. No fire, no water, no stopping. He reached into his kit and pulled a piece out and chewed it as he walked. The toughness of the dried meat meant it required significant chewing, which slowed the eating, extended the experience of consuming it, gave the digestive system time to begin processing the nutrients before the stomach registered that it wanted more. This was not accidental. Slow, effortful eating, food that takes real work to consume, is more efficient for a body that needs sustained fuel rather than a quick spike of energy. It feeds the system steadily rather than all at once. The warriors knew this not in biochemical terms. They did not have those words or those frameworks. But they knew it in the practical sense of generations of men learning what worked and what did not over hundreds of years of military experience. Mkando worked. It was the foundation of the warrior's personal ration kit, the backup when everything else ran out, the caloric bedrock on which the entire food system of the long march rested. One piece in the morning, one piece at midday, one piece when the march finally stopped and the camp was set and the body had given everything it had for the day. Not a meal in any conventional sense, but fuel. Real, serious, effective fuel. For a body that had to keep moving. Meal 2, amici. The fermented milk that kept them strong. If Mkando was the foundation, amici was the heart. Fermented milk. Soured milk. Milk that had been allowed to culture, to thicken and sour through the action of the natural bacteria present in the milk and in the containers it was stored in. Amici was not just food for the Zulu warrior. It was central to Zulu culture in a way that went far beyond nutrition. Cattle were the defining economic and social resource of Zulu society. The milk of those cattle, and the fermented product made from that milk, carried cultural weight that made it something between food and sacred substance. But on the march, its significance was practical. Fermented milk is a remarkable food for a body under sustained physical stress. The fermentation process transforms the raw milk into something that is easier to digest than fresh milk. The lactose that causes digestive problems in many people is partially broken down by the fermentation. The protein content is highly bioavailable, meaning the body can access and use it efficiently. The fat content provides slow-burning energy. The electrolytes, sodium, potassium, calcium, are present in quantities that matter for a body losing minerals through sustained sweating. And the live cultures introduced into the gut during fermentation support digestive function and immune response, both of which become critically important in a body under the sustained stress of a long campaign. The warrior carried amici in gourds, hollowed calabash gourds that had been prepared and seasoned specifically for this purpose. The gourd itself contributed to the fermentation process. The bacteria that lived in the seasoned inner surface of a well-used gourd were part of what made the Amasi culture correctly, giving it the specific flavor and consistency that Zulu palates recognized as right. A warrior's gourd was personal. Used repeatedly, never fully cleaned in the modern sense, the bacterial culture living in it was part of its value. A new, unseasoned gourd did not produce the same Amasi as an old, well-seasoned one. On the march, Amasi was consumed at rest stops. When the impi paused in its movement, the warriors would take a drink from their gourds. Not huge quantities. Not a meal in the sitting down taking your time sense. A long drink. Enough to deliver the protein and fat and electrolytes the body was calling for. Enough to sustain the muscles for the next stretch of ground. At camp, when the march stopped for the night, Amasi was consumed more substantially. Combined with other foods, with the cooked grain preparations that the Utabi would prepare, or with the dried meat, it formed the nutritional core of the evening meal. The protein and fat of the Amasi working alongside the carbohydrates of the grain to give the body what it needed for recovery overnight and preparation for the next day's march. The sound of a Zulu camp in the evening, the sounds of men resting after extreme exertion, the sounds of food being prepared and consumed, would have included the particular sound of Amasi being poured from gourds. A thick, slow liquid sound. The sound of the food that had been there for the whole march, carried on the body, doing its quiet work, sustaining, restoring, keeping the army strong enough to do it all again tomorrow. Meal 3, Isagwamba. Roasted grain for the long road, when the march was going to be long. When the commanders knew the impi would be moving for days without stopping in any meaningful way. When the body would need something steady and reliable to burn through, that was when Isagwamba became essential. Roasted grain. Simple. Instant. Effective. Sorghum or maize, dry roasted over fire before the march began. Not cooked in the wet sense, not boiled or softened into porridge. Roasted dry. Until the outer hull darkened slightly and the inner kernel hardened and the moisture inside reduced to almost nothing. The roasting did several things at once. It extended the shelf life dramatically. Dry roasted grain does not spoil the way fresh or cooked grain does. It could be carried for weeks without deteriorating. In the heat of southern Africa, in the conditions of a long march, this mattered enormously. It concentrated the calories. The moisture removed during roasting meant that a smaller volume of grain delivered more energy per mouthful than the same grain in its raw state. And it changed the way the body processed it. Roasted grain digests more slowly than soft-cooked grain. It releases its energy gradually, over hours rather than minutes. For a body that needs sustained fuel for a long march rather than a quick energy spike, this slow release is exactly right. The warrior carried Isagwamba in a small pouch. He ate it by the handful, walking, without stopping, without preparation, just reaching in, taking a handful, chewing steadily as the ground passed beneath his feet. It did not taste like much. It was not supposed to taste like much. It was supposed to keep him moving. And it did. Meal 4, wild roots and tubers. What the ground gave. Not everything the warrior ate came from his kit. The ground beneath his feet, the southern African landscape he was moving through, was full of food. If he knew where to look, if he knew what to dig for. If your eyes had been trained from boyhood to read the surface of the land the way other people read a face. Zulu warriors knew how to read the land. Wild roots and tubers grew throughout the grasslands and bush of the region. Some of them were known and eaten widely across the communities of southern Africa. Others were more locally known, specific to particular areas, recognized by the warriors from their own home territories who were moving through familiar terrain. The amadumb, the wild taro, a starchy tuber with dense, filling flesh, could be eaten raw in the field. Bitter sometimes, Not pleasant in the way that a prepared meal is pleasant, but filling, calorie-dense, delivering the carbohydrates a working body needed. Various other root vegetables, some with no common English names, known only in the botanical records and in the oral knowledge of the people who lived in that landscape, were dug up along the route of the march, quickly cleaned of soil and eaten on the move. This foraging capability was not random, was trained. Young men preparing for military service learned the edible plants of their region the way they learned tracking or weapons handling, deliberately, systematically, from men who knew the knowledge and understood its military value. On a long march into territory the warriors knew well, the landscape itself became part of the supply system. The ground contributed what it could. The warriors took it gratefully, not stopping, not preparing, just digging and moving and eating and moving. Meal 5, beer. But not the way you think. The word beer lands in a modern ear with modern associations. Relaxation, celebration, the end of a working day. Something consumed for pleasure in a comfortable setting. In the Zulu warriors' context, beer was none of these things. Mkombothi, traditional sorghum beer, was food. Genuinely, seriously food. A nutritional substance that delivered calories, carbohydrates, B vitamins, and live probiotic cultures in a form that the body absorbed efficiently. The alcohol content was low, much lower than modern commercial beer. This was not incidental, it was the point. Mkombothi in its traditional preparation was closer to a thick, slightly fermented grain drink than to an intoxicating beverage. The fermentation process was short enough to produce some alcohol but not enough to impair the physical and cognitive function that a warrior on campaign absolutely could not afford to impair. What it delivered instead was significant. The B vitamins produced during fermentation, B1, B2, B6, are essential for the conversion of food into energy. A body doing sustained physical work burns through B vitamins faster than a body at rest. Deficiency impairs the efficiency of energy production at the cellular level. The body literally cannot extract as much usable energy from the food it consumes. Mkombothi supplemented these vitamins constantly. The calories in the thick, grain-based liquid were substantial and quickly available. The body could access them faster than the calories in solid food, making beer an effective rapid fuel option at the end of a long day's march when the body needed quick restoration. Consumed at camp, in the evening, shared among the regiment, not in large quantities on a campaign. Enough. Enough to do the nutritional work it needed to do. And perhaps, just perhaps, enough to bring a moment of something almost like ease to a body that had been working hard all day. In a world that was not going to be easy tomorrow either. Meal 6, honey. The warrior's fast fuel. Find the bees. This was a skill. A real, specific, learnable skill that experienced foragers in the southern African landscape developed through practice. Reading the behavior of bees in the field, the direction they were flying, the height they were traveling, the particular activity patterns that meant a hive was nearby, and following those signs to the source. Wild honey was one of the most valuable food finds on a long march. The reason was simple and immediate. Honey is pure, rapidly available energy. The sugars in honey, primarily fructose and glucose, require almost no digestive processing before the body can use them. They enter the bloodstream quickly. They reach the muscles quickly. They restore depleted energy reserves faster than almost any other food. For a warrior at the end of a long march, muscles depleted, glycogen stores low, the body running on its last reserves, a piece of honeycomb could produce a rapid, real, physically noticeable restoration of capacity. The wax was eaten along with the honey. The protein-rich bee larvae in the comb were not discarded, they were consumed as well. This was not desperation. It was efficiency. The larvae were nutritious. Nothing available was wasted. Acquiring the honey was not without cost. Bees defending their hive are not gentle. The warrior who found a hive and wanted its contents was going to be stung repeatedly. This was accepted as part of the transaction, a temporary and manageable pain in exchange for a food resource of genuine value. Pain was managed. Moving was the priority. The honey was shared, not hoarded. A warrior who found a hive brought what he could carry back to his regiment. The sharing of food resources within the regiment was a cultural practice with deep roots in Zulu military society. You ate. Your brothers ate. Then you kept moving. Meal 7. Angusho. Broken corn and beans. When the impi stopped long enough to cook. Not always. Not even often on a fast-moving campaign. But when the march slowed. When the commanders allowed a longer rest. When the Utabi had time to work, that was when Umkusho appeared. Broken dried corn, mixed with dried beans, cooked together slowly over fire into a thick, dense, filling mass. Simple, ancient, deeply nourishing. The combination was not accidental. Corn and legumes together, grain and beans, produce a protein profile that neither delivers alone. The amino acids missing from the grain are present in the beans. The amino acids the beans lack are present in the grain. Together they give the body something close to a complete protein source. Something that repairs muscle tissue. Something that builds the physical capacity to keep going. This knowledge was not written down anywhere. No nutritionist designed the meal. But generations of people eating this combination. People doing hard physical work, people who felt the difference between eating it and not eating it, arrived at the same practical conclusion. This works. The Utabi prepared it in clay pots carried for exactly this purpose. Water from the nearest source. Fire built quickly and efficiently. The dried corn and beans, carried in the supply kit, added to the water and left to cook while the warriors rested. The smell of Umkusho cooking in a camp at the end of a hard day's march was something the warriors would have known immediately, would have responded to in the body before the mind caught up. The particular easing that happens when hungry people smell food being prepared, eaten from shared vessels, without ceremony, without sitting at a table or arranging a meal in any formal sense. Just men, sitting on the ground, eating from a pot, refueling, ready for tomorrow. Meal 8, roasted insects, protein from the air. This one surprises people. It should not. Insects are one of the most efficient protein sources available in the natural world. More protein per gram of body weight than beef. Far less effort to acquire than hunting large game. Available in enormous quantities across the southern African landscape, particularly during certain seasons when specific species appear in numbers that make collection almost effortless. The warriors knew this. Flying ants, in Zulu called Izinawa, appear in massive numbers after the first rains of the season. They emerge from the ground in swarms so dense that the air thickens with them. For a foraging warrior, this was an extraordinary food event. The ants could be caught by the handful, roasted quickly over a small fire or even eaten raw. The fat content of the flying ant is high. The body that prepared these insects for their mating flight stored energy reserves that translate directly into caloric value for the person eating them. Locusts, termites, certain caterpillars known to be edible and nutritious, various beetle species. All of these appeared in the warrior's diet when the march took him through terrain where they were available. The preparation was minimal. A few minutes over fire, enough to kill parasites, enough to add a slight crunch and a roasted flavor. Then eaten. Immediately. On the move if necessary. There was no squeamishness about this in Zulu warrior culture. Squeamishness is a luxury. A luxury that the body, working hard in a difficult landscape far from its supply lines, simply cannot afford. The insect was food. The warrior was hungry. That was the complete calculation. Meal 9. Fresh blood mixed with milk. This is the meal that most surprises people from outside the culture. And yet, from a nutritional standpoint, it is perhaps the most sophisticated item on this entire list. In Zulu cattle keeping culture, drawing blood from a living animal without killing it was a practiced skill. A small incision in the jugular vein. A controlled quantity of blood drawn off. The wound closed cleanly afterward. The animal unharmed. Ready to provide again at a later time. The blood was mixed with amici, the fermented milk we have already discussed, and consumed together. The nutritional combination this produces is remarkable. Blood is extraordinarily rich in bioavailable iron. Iron is essential for hemoglobin, the protein in red blood cells that carries oxygen to the muscles. A body doing sustained heavy aerobic work, marching long distances at pace, has a high iron demand. The muscles working hard need oxygen delivered efficiently. Iron deficiency impairs this delivery at the most fundamental level. Combined with the protein and fat of the fermented milk, the blood delivered a rapid, comprehensive nutritional package that addressed multiple deficiencies simultaneously. The iron restored oxygen carrying capacity. The protein supported muscle repair. The fat provided slow-burning energy. And the electrolytes in the milk replaced what the body had lost through sustained sweating. This was not a ritual consumption. Not a ceremonial practice divorced from practical purpose. It was, understood in modern nutritional terms, an almost perfectly engineered recovery food for a body under extreme aerobic stress. The warriors did not have those words, but they had the generations of practical experience that produced the same conclusion. Drink this, after the hard march, before the next one, will keep you strong. Meal 10. River fish, caught fast, eaten faster. The impi moved through a landscape crossed by rivers. The Tequila, the Mzimvubu, the Mfolozi, the Mlotus. Dozens of smaller waterways threading through the hills and valleys of the Zulu heartland and the territories beyond it. Every river crossing was also a food opportunity. The fish in these rivers were not hard to catch for men who had grown up near water and knew how to work it. Simple techniques, weirs made from stones and branches to channel fish into a narrowed space, spearing in the shallows, hand fishing in pools where fish congregated, produced results quickly. Speed was the priority. The march did not stop for fishing the way a leisure fishing trip stops. A small group of warriors would work a section of river while the main force rested or moved through. 10 minutes, 20. Whatever the tactical situation allowed. The fish caught in this time were eaten simply, gutted quickly, cooked over a fast fire if time allowed. The flesh firm and white and hot from the flame, eaten with the hands, bones worked clean. Or eaten raw in the way that hungry people have always eaten raw fish when cooking was not possible. Quickly, without ceremony, extracting the nutrition the body needed and moving on. Fresh fish delivered something that the preserved, dried foods in the warrior's kit could not. Omega-3 fatty acids, essential fats that support brain function, reduce inflammation in overworked muscles, and maintain the cardiovascular efficiency a marching body demands. Minerals not always present in adequate quantities in the land-based diet. High-quality protein in a highly digestible form. Fish protein is among the most bioavailable of any animal protein source. And water. The flesh of a freshwater fish contains significant moisture, helpful to a body that was constantly fighting the balance between fluid loss and fluid replacement in the heat of a southern African campaign. The fish was not a luxury. It was a fortunate supplement, a gift from the river, taken, appreciated in the practical way that hungry men appreciate food. And then the march continued. Meal 11, Amfino, The wild greens that nobody talks about. There is a particular moment on a long march when the body starts asking for something specific. Not meat, not grain, not even water exactly. Something green. It is not a craving in the casual sense. It is a signal. A deep, physical communication from the body's systems telling the brain that something important is running low. That the diet of dried meat and roasted grain and fermented milk, as effective as those foods are for fuel and protein, is missing something that the body genuinely needs to keep functioning at the level the march demands. The warriors of the Zulu Impi knew this signal, and they knew what to do when it came. The southern African landscape, the grasslands and bush and riverine vegetation that the Impi moved through, was full of edible greens. Wild plants whose leaves and young shoots were nutritious and available and, for the trained eye, visible everywhere along the route of the march. Umfino was the general term. Not one specific plant, a category. A way of describing the practice of gathering and eating the edible leafy greens that grew wild in the landscape. Different plants in different seasons and different terrain. But the practice consistent. The knowledge deep and specific and carefully held. Amaranth leaves, known across much of Africa under various names, growing in disturbed soil and along roadsides and near water sources. Dark green, slightly bitter when raw. Rich in iron, calcium, and the fat-soluble vitamins A and K that the body stores and uses for a wide range of essential functions. Blackjack, the plant called watadillo in Zulu, a dark-leaved annual that grew abundantly across the region and that most modern people know only as a garden weed. To the Zulu warrior moving through the landscape with hungry eyes, it was food. Young leaves stripped quickly from the stem as he walked, eaten raw or bundled into his kit for later preparation. Wild spinach varieties, young shoots of certain grasses, the tender new growth of specific shrub species that appeared in particular seasons. All of it gathered on the move, eaten fresh, delivering the micronutrients, the vitamins and minerals that preserved foods could not provide. The specific nutritional value of what Umfino delivered cannot be overstated in the context of a military campaign. Vitamin C is perhaps the most critical. The preserved foods that formed the backbone of the warrior's campaign diet, the dried meat, the roasted grain, the fermented milk, contain minimal vitamin C. And vitamin C is not a food the body can store for long. It needs regular replenishment. Without it, the body's ability to repair tissue is compromised. Wounds heal more slowly. Connective tissue weakens. In extreme and prolonged deficiency, the disease called scurvy develops. A catastrophic breakdown of the body's structural integrity that has destroyed armies throughout history. No Zulu Impi was going to develop scurvy. Not because their commanders understood scurvy in the medical sense, but because the foraging culture that was built into the warrior's training, the habit of eating what the landscape offered, including its greens, meant that vitamin C was entering the body regularly, keeping the deficiency from developing. Iron from the leafy greens supplemented the iron from the blood consumption. Together, these two sources maintained the hemoglobin levels that the marching body needed. The calcium in the greens, working alongside the calcium in the fermented milk, maintained the bone density and muscle contraction efficiency that sustained heavy marching demands. Folate, magnesium, potassium, all present in the wild greens, all essential for the biochemical processes that keep a working body working. The warrior who gathered Umfino on the march was not doing something supplementary, something optional, something that could be skipped when the march was fast and the terrain was not offering obvious greens. He was maintaining his body's capacity for sustained effort in one of the most fundamental ways available to him. The green leaves in his hand as he walked, small, unremarkable looking, easy to overlook in any account of the Zulu army's military capabilities, but real. and necessary, and part of the comprehensive food system that kept the impi operational. There was also a cultural dimension to Umfino that matters. Food preparation among Zulu women at home involved umfino regularly, cooked, mixed with other ingredients, prepared in ways that were familiar and comforting and deeply connected to home. For the warrior on the march, eating wild greens in the raw and hurried way of a campaign was a distant echo of that home food. Not the same. Not the warmth and preparation of a meal made by someone who loved you, but something connected to it, a flavor that carried a memory, a taste of the home territory even when the march had taken the warrior far from it. These small connections mattered, not sentimentally, practically. A warrior who maintains some psychological connection to his home, his community, his family, the world he is fighting to protect, is a more effective warrior than one who has lost that connection entirely. The food was fuel for the body, but it was also, in small ways, fuel for the spirit. Both kinds of fuel mattered on the long march. Meal 12, roasted sweet potato and wild yam. The fuel that went deep. Not every march moved through empty wilderness. The Zulu kingdom in its period of greatest expansion was surrounded by agricultural communities. Smaller kingdoms, chiefdoms, farming settlements that cultivated the land and stored food in ways that the moving impi could access. Sometimes through trade. Sometimes through tribute paid to the Zulu kingdom. Sometimes, in the context of raids and campaigns, through requisition. Among the agricultural foods that the warriors encountered in these communities, the root vegetables stood out. Sweet potato, wild yam. The amidum that the agricultural communities along the march routes cultivated in their gardens and stored in underground caches designed to keep them through the dry season. These foods did something that the dried and preserved foods in the warrior's personal kit could not fully replicate. They delivered carbohydrates in a form that the body converts to energy with extraordinary efficiency, but slowly, sustainably over an extended period. Not the quick sugar spike of honey. Not the slower but still relatively fast burn of roasted grain. Something deeper and more sustained than either. The sweet potato in particular has a glycemic response, the rate at which it raises blood sugar, that is almost perfectly calibrated for sustained endurance effort. It enters the bloodstream gradually enough to provide hours of steady fuel rather than a quick peak followed by a crash. The fiber in the flesh slows digestion further. The natural sugars are accompanied by potassium, one of the key electrolytes the body loses through sustained sweating and one of the most critical for muscle function. A warrior with a roasted sweet potato in his hands at the midpoint of a long day's march was receiving something that would carry him through the second half of that march more effectively than almost anything else available in that landscape. The preparation was minimal. Fire and time, that was all a sweet potato needed. Push it into the coals of a campfire. Leave it. Pull it out when the skin was charred and the flesh inside had softened into something dense and sweet and deeply satisfying. Eat it with the hands, the charred skin adding its own bitter contrast to the sweetness of the flesh inside. Wild yam was less immediately pleasant. It required more preparation. Certain varieties contained compounds that caused irritation if eaten raw, that needed to be neutralized by cooking. But properly prepared, wild yam delivered a caloric density that rivaled any other food available in the landscape. Dense, starchy, filling in a way that lasted. The warriors who knew the landscape knew where these foods grew wild and where the agricultural communities that cultivated them were located along the march routes. This knowledge was part of the military intelligence that experienced commanders carried, not just the terrain and the rivers and the defensive positions of the enemy, but the food resources along the route, where the sweet potato gardens were, where the yam stores were kept, how much of what could be found in a given area. Food was military intelligence. The feeding of the impi was as much a strategic consideration as the deployment of its fighting strength. A hungry army, no matter how well trained and disciplined, is a degraded army. The commanders knew this. And the sweet potato, humble, unremarkable, almost invisible in any dramatic account of the Zulu military, was part of the answer. Meal 13. Ubhanshizi. Dried beans carried from home. The beans were always there. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that anyone would notice or record. No oral historian was ever going to compose praise poetry about the dried beans in the warrior's kit. No account of a great battle was going to credit the beans with the victory. But the beans were always there. Ubhanshizi, dried beans, various types, the product of the agricultural year in the warrior's home community. Harvested at the end of the growing season. Dried until they were hard as stones. Small and dense and almost weightless relative to their nutritional content. Tucked into the warrior's kit alongside the dried meat and the roasted grain. The value of the dried bean on a long march was not dramatic. It was quiet and consistent and cumulative, the kind of value that does not announce itself but that is deeply felt in its absence. Beans are one of the most complete plant-based foods available in the agricultural repertoire of southern Africa. The protein they contain, while not as bioavailable as animal protein, while lacking some of the amino acids present in meat, fills gaps in a diet that has been heavy on fat and grain-based carbohydrates. Gaps that, left unfilled over days and weeks of hard marching, produce a creeping physical degradation that is hard to pinpoint but very real. The muscle mass that the warrior had built through years of training, the physical capital that was the foundation of his military capability, required consistent protein to maintain under sustained stress. The body under extreme physical exertion will, if protein intake is insufficient, begin to break down muscle tissue to use as fuel. Not quickly, not visibly, but gradually. A slow erosion of the physical strength that the march demanded. The beans slowed this erosion. Combined with the dried meat and the amici, the other protein sources in the warrior's kit, the beans maintained the protein intake at a level that protected muscle mass through the weeks of a campaign. The fiber in the beans served a different but equally important function. A diet dominated by preserved and dried foods, stripped of much of their fiber content through the drying process, is a diet that creates digestive difficulties over time. Difficulties that, in the context of a military campaign, were not just uncomfortable but operationally significant. A warrior dealing with serious digestive problems was a warrior whose physical performance was impaired, whose sleep was disrupted, whose body was spending energy on an internal problem rather than on the march. The beans kept things moving, in the most practical, unglamorous, essential sense. They were soaked when water was available and time allowed. A few hours in water beginning the rehydration process that made them easier and faster to cook. Then added to whatever else was being prepared over the campfire. Or ground roughly and added to grain preparations. Or simply simmered alone in water until they softened enough to eat. In the field, when no cooking was possible, warriors who had learned to manage the difficulty of eating raw dried beans would eat them as they were. Small, hard, requiring significant chewing, but delivering their nutritional content regardless of preparation method. The taste was neutral, filling, familiar in the way that food from home is always familiar, not exciting, not a culinary experience, but deeply recognizable. A taste that said, "This is from your world. This was grown in your community's soil. The women of your homestead dried these and packed them for you." There was comfort in that. In the middle of a march that had taken the warrior far from everything familiar, in terrain that was not his terrain, moving toward a confrontation that might end in his death, the small, hard, unremarkable bean in his hand, the taste of home. The relationship between these foods, between umfino and the roasted sweet potato and the dried beans, tells us something important about the Zulu military food system that is easy to miss if we look at each food individually. No single item in the warrior's diet was complete on its own. Each one addressed specific nutritional needs. Each one filled specific gaps that the others left open. The dried meat provided the protein and fat backbone. The fermented milk added electrolytes and additional protein and the probiotic support of live cultures. The roasted grain delivered carbohydrate fuel. The wild greens supplied the micronutrients. The beans filled the protein gaps and managed digestive health. The sweet potato and wild yam delivered the deep, sustained carbohydrate energy that long marching demanded. Together, consumed in the varied, opportunistic, responsive way of a military culture that had spent generations learning what worked, they formed a system. Not a design system. Not a system that anyone sat down and planned from first principles. A system that emerged from experience. From the accumulated practical wisdom of generations of warriors and commanders and the communities that supplied them. From the simple, repeated, real-world test of what kept men going and what did not. What kept men going was variety, was responsiveness to what the landscape offered, was the combination of carried provisions and foraged supplements, was the deep, practical nutritional intelligence that Zulu military culture embedded in its warriors from boyhood. Not one food, all of them, together, working. There is another dimension to these meals that numbers and nutrients cannot fully capture. The social dimension. Food on the march was not eaten alone when it could be helped. The sharing of food within the regiment, the ibutho, the age group that a warrior lived and trained and fought alongside from boyhood, was a practice with cultural roots that went far deeper than military logistics. When a warrior found honey or caught fish or dug up tubers or gathered wild greens, he brought what he could back to his brothers. The ones who had not found food that day. The ones whose kit was running low. The ones who were struggling with the pace of the march and needed something to help them keep up. This sharing was not enforced by regulation. It did not need to be. It was built into the culture of the ibutho, the deep, lifelong bond between age mates that Zulu military society deliberately cultivated precisely because a group of men who genuinely looked out for each other was a more effective fighting unit than a group of individuals competing for resources. You fed your brother fed you. And the regiment, the collective of all these mutual obligations, moved as one. This was the true foundation of the Zulu military's extraordinary effectiveness. Not just the physical conditioning, not just the tactical sophistication, not just the food system as remarkable as it was. The bond between the men. The fact that the man beside you on the march was someone you had grown up with, trained with, shared food with for years. Someone whose hunger you recognized because you had been hungry alongside him. Someone you would not abandon because abandoning him was unthinkable. The food passed between hands on the march was not just nutrition. It was the physical expression of that bond. One man's hand to another man's hand. One man's hunger answered by another man's provision. The army feeding itself. Not through logistics alone. Through brotherhood. The day of the march is moving toward its evening. The light is changing. The particular gold of late afternoon in southern Africa, warm and long and generous, painting the grassland in colors that are almost too beautiful for a hard day's work. The warriors have been moving since before the sun was fully up. The ground covered is measured not in miles but in the deep, accumulated fatigue of a body that has given everything it had and is being asked to give a little more before the camp is set and the fires are lit and the rest begins. In a few hours there will be food. Real food. The umkusho in the cooking pot, the amici from the gourd, whatever the foragers brought back from the terrain they moved through today. But for now there is just the walking. The steady, disciplined, almost meditative walking of men who have been trained to cover ground and are covering it. Feet finding the path, bodies maintaining the pace, minds in the particular state of a long march, not fully focused on the present, not fully elsewhere, suspended in the rhythm of movement. The man beside you reaches into his kit. He breaks off a piece of dried meat. He passes half to you without looking, without breaking stride, without any ceremony or comment. You take it. You chew steadily as you walk. The taste is strong and familiar. The salt of it, the dense chew of it, the particular flavor of meat that has been dried in the sun of the Zulu hills, the taste of home, of everything that is waiting for you at the end of the campaign, of everything you are marching to protect. You chew. You walk. The grassland passes beneath your feet. The sun moves lower. The camp is not far now. Let your body settle into the rhythm of it, the steady, patient rhythm of the march. Almost there. Almost. Meal 14, Isajinji. Pumpkin and maize. The camp meal that restored everything. The camp is set. The march has stopped. Finally. The commanders have given the word, and the word moves through the regiment the way relief always moves through tired bodies. Not loudly. Not with celebration. Just a collective releasing. A letting go of the pace. A permission for the legs and the back and the arms and the mind to stop holding everything together quite so tightly. The Utabi move quickly. This is their moment. The moment their role in the campaign becomes most visible, most valued. These boys, young, not yet old enough to fight, assigned to the regiment to learn the ways of the military world before they joined it fully, have been carrying the cooking equipment and the supplementary food supplies through the same long day that the warriors marched, carrying without complaint, because complaint was not part of the culture they were being formed in, because one day they would be the warrior and someone else would be caring for them, and because they understood, with the practical wisdom of young people who have been given real responsibility, that what they carried and what they prepared tonight mattered. The fires go up. Multiple fires across the camp. The smell of smoke rising into the cooling evening air. The particular smell of a military camp at the end of a hard day. Fires and food beginning, and the accumulated smell of many men who have worked hard in the heat. And into the pots. Into the clay vessels that the Utabi have carried all day. Water. Then dried maize, not the roasted isagwamba of the march, but dried maize prepared for proper cooking, soaked if there was time earlier in the day, added to the water now to begin the long, slow softening that transforms it. And pumpkin. The pumpkin. This is the part that people who think of warrior food as purely functional, purely about protein and calories and performance metrics, might not expect. Pumpkin was grown throughout the agricultural communities of the Zulu world. Dried and preserved, it traveled on campaign in a form that kept well and added a dimension to the camp meal that went beyond nutrition. The flesh of the pumpkin, cooked down into the maize mixture, added a natural sweetness, a softness, a quality that the dried and preserved foods of the march could not provide. It added something that felt like home. Isajinji was comfort food. Real comfort food, not in the trivial modern sense of something eaten for emotional consolation, but in the original, deeper sense. Food that comforted the body and the spirit simultaneously. That gave the tired warrior something at the end of a hard day that was not just fuel, that was warmth, that was softness, that reminded the body what it was working toward. The nutritional value was real and significant. Pumpkin is extraordinarily rich in beta-carotene, the compound the body converts to vitamin A. Vitamin A is essential for immune function. A body under the sustained physical and psychological stress of a military campaign is a body whose immune defenses are under pressure. The stress hormones that sustained exertion produces have documented immunosuppressive effects. Keeping the immune system functioning through a long campaign was not just about health in a general sense. It was about military effectiveness. Sick warriors could not march, could not fight. Every illness that moved through a regiment reduced its combat capability in a direct and measurable way. The pumpkin in the pot was, among other things, immune support. The maize delivered dense carbohydrate energy, the deep restoration of glycogen stores that the muscles desperately needed after a day of sustained effort. Glycogen is the form in which the body stores carbohydrate fuel in the muscles and liver. Sustained endurance exercise depletes it progressively. Without replenishment, performance degrades, not just slightly but significantly. The ability to maintain pace, to respond quickly, to keep the muscles contracting efficiently through the next day's demands. All of this depended on restoring those glycogen stores during the rest period. The maize did that. And together, the maize and the pumpkin cooked slowly into a thick, warm, filling mass. Isijinji gave the warrior's body a comprehensive restoration that the foods of the march itself could not provide. Not because those foods were insufficient for what the march demanded, but because the march demanded one thing and recovery demanded another. And Isijinji was recovery food. Specifically, effectively, beautifully recovery food. It was eaten slowly. This matters. This is worth noting. The warrior who had been eating on the move all day, grabbing dried meat and roasted grain and wild greens without stopping, consuming food as a functional act integrated into the march rather than as a separate, deliberate experience, now sat down, now held a vessel of warm food in his hands, now ate at a pace that allowed the body to register what it was receiving, to taste, to feel the warmth of it moving down, to experience something that was not just fuel but nourishment in the fuller sense of that word. The eating of Isijinji in the camp at the end of a hard day was a restoration of something more than calories. It was a restoration of humanity, of the experience of being a person who sits and eats and rests, not just a body covering ground, not just a fighting unit maintaining pace, a person, with hunger and warmth and the particular satisfaction of food that is right for the moment and the body in the need. The warriors ate together, sitting in groups around the fires, the heat of the food warming the hands that held the vessels, the smell of the camp, smoke and food, and the cooling night air of the southern African landscape surrounding everything, voices beginning to return. The low conversations of men who have been too focused on the march to talk, now released into the easier register of rest. Stories, observations about the day's terrain. Jokes in the way that men who have been through something hard together make jokes, not laughing away the difficulty but acknowledging it, transforming it into something shared and therefore manageable. The young warrior who was on his first long march, who had trained for years for exactly this but was now living the reality of it for the first time, sat with his Ibutho brothers around the fire, held his vessel of Isijinji, felt the warmth of it, and felt, for the first time since the march began, something close to all right. Not comfortable, not safe. The campaign was not over, the danger was not resolved. Tomorrow would bring its own demands. But all right. The food in his hands, his brothers beside him, the fire burning steadily, the night sky above, the same sky that was above his home, above his family, above everything he was marching to protect. All right. That was enough. That was exactly enough. Meal 15. Amlakwa. The chicken that meant the march was almost done. The last meal on this list is not the most nutritionally sophisticated. It is not the most strategically important. It does not address the most critical deficiency or deliver the most essential nutrient or solve the most complex logistical problem of feeding an army on the move. But it is the most human. Because the 15th meal, the meal of umlakwa, of chicken prepared in the particular way of the Zulu homestead, was not a march meal. It was a homecoming meal. The campaign is over. The impi is returning. The long march that went out is now coming back. Through familiar terrain now, through the hills and valleys and rivers of the Zulu heartland, toward the homesteads and the families and the communities that waited. And as the returning warriors approached their home territory, as the landscape around them shifted from the unfamiliar terrain of the campaign to the known, loved terrain of home, the communities came out to meet them. With food. Always with food. Chicken was the food of significant occasions in Zulu society. Not the everyday food of ordinary life. Not the sorghum porridge and the amici and the dried beans of the daily diet. Chicken was prepared for moments that mattered. For celebrations. For the honoring of guests. For the marking of transitions that deserved to be acknowledged with something more than the ordinary. The return of warriors from a campaign was exactly this kind of moment. The women of the homestead, who had been managing everything in the warriors' absence, who had kept the agricultural work going, who had maintained the homestead, looked after the children and the elders, managed the food stores, held the whole structure of daily life together through the weeks or months that the men were gone. These women prepared the chicken. Not quickly, not minimally, with the full attention and skill of people who understood that the meal they were preparing was not just food, it was a statement, a welcome, an acknowledgement of what the returning men had endured and what their return meant. The preparation involved time, the fire, the careful management of heat, the addition of wild herbs gathered from the surrounding landscape, plants that added flavor and aroma and, not incidentally, additional micronutrients to the final dish. The fat of the bird rendered into the cooking and absorbed back into the flesh. The broth that developed in the pot, dense and aromatic and deeply flavored with everything that had gone into it, consumed alongside the meat. The returning warrior who sat down to a meal of umlukwa was a man whose body was in a specific state. Weeks of campaign had taken their toll. Not the dramatic, visible toll of wounds or obvious illness, but the gradual, cumulative toll of sustained physical stress, of constant movement, of sleep that was never fully adequate, of food that was always sufficient for performance but never quite sufficient for full recovery, of the psychological weight of living in a state of readiness, the vigilance that a military campaign demands and that a body cannot maintain indefinitely without cost. He was depleted in ways that his training had prepared him to manage, but depleted nonetheless. And the umlukwa addressed this depletion in ways that mattered. The protein of the chicken, highly digestible, rich in the essential amino acids that muscle tissue rebuilds itself from, began the deeper repair that the body had been waiting to perform. During the campaign, the warrior's body had been doing emergency maintenance, patching rather than rebuilding, keeping things functional rather than restoring them fully. Now, with the chicken in front of him and the march behind him, the body could begin to do the deeper work. The fat delivered dense, slow-burning energy that went not to fueling immediate exertion but to rebuilding the body's depleted reserves. The connective tissue and cartilage in the bird, rich in collagen, supported the repair of the joints and tendons that the long march had stressed. The herbs added antimicrobial compounds, antioxidants, flavor that was complex and specific and deeply associated in the warrior's memory with home, with safety, with the world beyond the campaign. He ate slowly. There was no reason to eat quickly now. No march to return to. No pace to maintain. No terrain to cover before the light went. He sat. He ate. He tasted. Really tasted, in the way that a person who has been eating for function for weeks, rather than for pleasure, rediscovers what food can be when the urgency is removed from it. His children sat nearby, watching him eat. The way children watch a returned parent, with the particular intensity of people who have been missing someone and are now checking, with their eyes, that the person is real and present and all right. He met their eyes. He nodded. He was all right. These 15 meals: Mkando, emisi, isagwamba, wild roots, beer, honey, umkisho, insect, blood and milk, river fish, umfino, sweet potato and yam, dried beans, isajinji, and the chicken that meant coming home, taken together, read together, understood as a system rather than a list. They tell a story that no battle account tells, no praise poem, no record of victories and campaigns and the movements of armies across the landscape of southern Africa. They tell the story of a body, a human body, trained and conditioned and prepared with extraordinary care, deployed in service of a community and a kingdom and a culture, sustained through weeks of extreme physical demand by a food system that was sophisticated in every way that mattered, not in the ways of laboratories and nutritional science, but in the ways of generations of practical human experience, accumulated and refined and passed down through the culture until it was as natural as walking. The body that ate these foods covered extraordinary distances, maintained extraordinary discipline, fought with extraordinary effectiveness when the fighting came, not despite the food, because of it, the dried meat that never ran out, the fermented milk that kept the muscles working, the wild greens that kept the body's deep systems functioning, the honey that restored the depleted reserves, the pumpkin and maize that gave back what the march had taken, all of it working together. All of it part of the same answer to the same question that every military force in the history of the world has had to answer. How do you keep a human body going? Through everything the march demands. Through heat and distance and sustained effort and the psychological weight of living at the edge of what the body can do. The Zulu answer was not one food, was many. Varied, responsive, intelligent in the way that only deep, accumulated, lived knowledge is intelligent. It was the land, and the cattle, and the cultivated crops, and the wild plants and the insects and the fish in the river water, and the hands of the women who dried and prepared and packed what the warriors carried, and the hands of the Udeby boys who cooked at the end of the hard day, and the hands of the community that came out to meet the returning men with the best food they had. All of it was the answer. Let your body grow heavy now. Let your breathing slow down, deeper. You have walked a long way tonight, through the grassland and the rivers and the hills of a world that was extraordinary in ways that history does not always make visible. You have eaten the food of the march, the dried meat and the wild honey and the fermented milk, the roasted grain carried in a small pouch, the wild greens gathered with quick hands from the landscape. You have sat around the fire, with the isajinji warm in your hands, with your brothers beside you, with the enormous southern African sky above, thick with stars, familiar, patient, steady. You have come home. The chicken is finished. The fire has burned lower. The children are asleep. And you are here, still here. After everything the march gave you, after every mile and every hunger and every moment of digging deeper than you thought there was left to dig, still here. Let the warmth of the fire find you now. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest. The grassland is quiet outside. The Zulu hills are dark and soft in the night. The cattle are settled. The homestead is breathing. And you are breathing too, slowly, deeply. The breath of a person who has earned their rest, who has given everything they had, and made it home. Let sleep come gently now. Let it come the way the night comes over the Zulu hills, slowly, softly, without rushing, covering everything, holding everything, carrying you down, into the deep, warm, quiet dark, where the march cannot follow, where the morning is still far away, where there is nothing at all that you need to do, except rest. Good night.